This morning, our first session, we're really excited to have, I think, a great example of what we can all learn from a really broad view of thinking across disciplines. I don't think we probably would have thought that our opening speaker at CMSS would be a social psychologist. But in fact, that's exactly, I think, what our specialty societies need right now. So we're incredibly excited. And for those of you who live in the world of social media and tweeting, our hashtag will be Stronger Together. And I'm incredibly excited to invite Julia Minson, who is a associate professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She specifically focuses on this incredibly interesting area of studying the psychology of disagreement. And part of what Dr. Minson will give us a sense of is how do we navigate these national divides on some of these issues that are coming forward more and more often, not only in the context of what we can do organizationally, but incredibly interestingly, what she's already done work on, in understanding how you open up conversations to even address issues like vaccine hesitancy. She'll be followed by a great panel to really offer some examples of what the struggles have been, and then she'll join that panel and offer her insights as well. So please, Professor Minson.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Good morning. Thank you so much. As Helen mentioned, I am a social psychologist, and most of the research I have done in the course of my career deals with the question of how do we have thoughtful, engaged, respectful conversations with people whose attitudes, values, and even fundamental beliefs about what's true and what's false are in direct opposition to our own. Now, disagreement is a fundamental part of all of our social lives. And when handled well, disagreement can actually be really beneficial to organizations. But disagreement often has sort of a bad rep, right? We know from prior research that when people give heavy considerations to opposing perspectives, leaders and organizations make better decisions. They have better forecasting accuracy. We also know that engaging organizational voice, especially minority voices, tends to lead to higher loyalty and organizational commitment and lower turnover. We know that in conflict contexts, when people feel heard, disagreement is less likely to escalate. So this point was probably best made over 100 years ago by a person who was quite blunt in his statements. This is William Wrigley Jr., the founder of Wrigley's Gum. And he once said that when two men in business always agree, one of them is unnecessary. Now, the research notwithstanding, organizations regularly fail to adequately manage disagreement in their ranks. And as a result, you get scenes like these. So these are Wayfair employees protesting their company's sale of furniture to border detention centers. These are, of course, the recent walkouts at Disney when employees were protesting what they felt was the company's overly tepid response to the infamous Don't Say Gay bill. And these are Boeing employees protesting that company's vaccine mandates. So a lot of what this brings up for me is if disagreement is as wonderful and important as the research says, why are we so bad at it, right? As a psychologist, the way I think about it is what are the fundamental psychological roots of conflict around attitudes and beliefs, right? And for you folks who lead organizations, probably the more important question is, what can organizations actually do to help people disagree better? Now, some of the most important ideas about disagreement in social psychology come from research on a phenomenon that we call naive realism. Naive realism is a mindset, it's a belief that basically says, look, I see the world as it really is. I believe that my views are an objective, unmediated reflection of some actual reality out there, right? Like I am an objective, smart, sensible person, and I get it. Now, that is a really efficient way to go through your physical world, right? So it makes good sense to believe in the evidence of your sensory organs. You shouldn't touch things that are hot. You shouldn't walk into things that are solid. The problem is people apply the same mindset to really complex, hotly contested social and political issues, right? So we apply the same mindset of I get it to issues of fairness and justice and appropriateness and morality. And this has two really important and kind of thorny consequences. One is that we tend to expect that reasonable others will agree with us. This is why we all overestimate how likely we are to win elections. The second one is even more problematic, which is what happens when we encounter disagreement. And that is we tend to attribute disagreement to error and bias and malevolent motives on the part of the other person. So in other words, if you disagree with me, it is because either you don't know the facts, or you're too dumb to understand the facts, or now that I have explained the facts to you very slowly and in small sentences, it must be that you are protecting your own self-interest and you just don't want to get it, okay? Now, there are some important sort of psychological subtleties here. One is that people do recognize that their experiences and their backgrounds shape their views. But what they tend to think is that those experiences and those backgrounds are giving them greater clarity about the actual truth of the matter. And it is the other people's experiences and backgrounds that are leading to distortion and bias. And of course, when both sides of an argument feel that way, both of them can't be right at the same time. Now, it turns out that what people get right is the bias in others. When we think that other people are not being objective, we're kind of right, because none of us are being objective. Where we're wrong is basically our failure to recognize that similar factors play a role in our own beliefs and in our own reactions to the events around us. So here are some data to support some of these conjectures. So this is a paper that was published in PNAS in 2020. This is Proceeds of National Academy of Science. And what these researchers did was sort of a very simple but very elegant study. They approached Trump and Clinton supporters during the 2016 presidential election, and they asked them the extent to which their own views and the other party's views were being influenced by a series of sort of valid normative considerations versus biases and distortions. So here are examples of what they considered valid and normative: careful consideration of the issues, interest in what's good for the country, knowledge of facts and history. Those are the kinds of things that we should base our policy judgments on. And here's what they considered biases: biased media coverage, misinformation, propaganda, self-interest, okay? And so you get a list of these things, and you're asked the extent to which your own views and the other side's views are informed by each of these factors on the 0 to 4 scale. And here is what they get. This looks like a crazy graph, but it's actually very, very rich data. We can start by looking at the far side here. So this is folks who identify as very strong Trump supporters. What they do is they say, look, the views of the people on my side, right, other Trump supporters, the red bars, are primarily driven by objective and normative considerations. And it is the views of the Clinton supporters, the blue bars, that are primarily driven by bias and distortion and misinformation propaganda, right? The fascinating thing is that the pattern is exactly the same on the other side, right? So the pattern is symmetrical and is exacerbated by partisanship, right? The stronger you feel about the issue, the more you think that you're very right and the other side is very wrong. The other piece here that's interesting and kind of depressing is the people in the middle. They think everybody is biased, right? For those people, the Trump supporters, the Clinton supporters, they're all way below zero, okay? And so this is sort of the state of events that plays out in most of our minds with respect to most controversial issues. The question is, what can we do about it, okay? The what can we do question, the way I think about it, is basically at 3 levels of analysis. What can we do at the level of individual psychology? What can we do in our interpersonal interactions? And what can we do to transform organizations, okay? So with the individual side, I'm going to start with research that I have been doing in my lab for about 15 years at this point on this idea of receptiveness to opposing views. So we define receptiveness as the willingness to access, consider, and evaluate supporting and opposing views in a relatively impartial manner. It is a mouthful of an academic definition, but you all are doctors, so you're used to like long words and long sentences. So let me unpack it for you for just a second. The idea here is that when most people approach opposing views, they tend to favor information from their own side. They tend to spend more time seeking it out, right, accessing it. They spend more time thinking about it. And then when they're all done at the end of the day, they say, look, the information on my side is better. And there's well-documented research showing that there's sort of a big gap in how people assess information at all of those stages of information processing. What we're saying is that there are some people in the world who do this less. So that's what we call being receptive, is showing less of a gap in how you treat opposing versus supporting views. The other piece that I want you to notice about this definition is what is not there. And what is not there is any mention of agreement or compromise, right? So when we say somebody's being receptive, we don't mean that they're compromising on their beliefs or that they're in any way ceding a position. What we mean is they are listening in a thoughtful, engaged way, and they're giving the opposing view as much mental time as they give the beliefs on their own side. Now, after sort of thinking long and hard about what the thing is, we thought, okay, well, how can we measure it? And we came up with a questionnaire scale, 18 items, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. It takes about 5 minutes to take. And we started administering it to large numbers of people in sort of a variety of contexts and backgrounds. And what we found is that it does, in fact, predict the types of behaviors we're interested in. So prior to this meeting, you all got the invitation to take the measure yourself. If you haven't had a chance to do it, you can go to receptiveness.net, and there's a handy-dandy button that says Take the Quiz, and you can find out how receptive you are, and you can save your own scores as a PDF. And what I can tell you is that people who are higher on receptiveness do think about opposing and supporting views differently. So one thing we know is that these folks actually do expose themselves to a more balanced information diet. So if you give them like a menu of things to read, they're more likely to read information from both sides, which you can imagine, right, is logical, because most people are wasting their time reading more and more supporting evidence for things they already believe to be true. We also know that people who are more receptive are better at paying attention to information on both sides of a divide. So we have done studies where we basically, plop participants in front of political speeches. And it turns out that if you listen to Mitch McConnell talk about, the Affordable Care Act for 10 minutes, you will kind of space out. And people on both sides of the aisle space out. They space out more when they're talking to the guy they disagree with, when they're listening to the guy they disagree with. But people who are more receptive tend to have a lesser gap. We also know that people who are more receptive evaluate information on both sides more accurately. They have more ideologically diverse friendship networks. So at work, they actually have colleagues that they talk to and rely on for advice and support that come from both political parties. And it turns out that people want to work with them. Receptiveness is seen by colleagues as a good thing. So when we say, how much would you like to get this person's opinion on a particular issue, they're more likely to say, yes, I'm interested in talking to this individual. So there's a lot of evidence that receptiveness predicts a different style of information processing. What is less apparent when you perhaps took the scale yourself is that it's actually made up of 4 sort of sub-factors. And for thinking about how you develop your own capacity for greater receptiveness, the sub-factors are important. The first one is what we call emotional equanimity. It's basically your tendency to have less negative emotions when you are exposed to opposing perspectives. So a higher score on this factor, just like on all the other factors, means you're more receptive. You're feeling less negative emotions, you're getting less angry, you're getting less frustrated, so you're more able to sort of stand in the face of this conversation and not have a really strong emotional response. The second factor is curiosity. So this is something, if you give the scale to a bunch of journalists, they tend to be very, very high on curiosity. They want to understand where these other people are coming from, why they believe what they believe. They find it intellectually valuable. Oops, what happened? Nope, going backwards. What is it? Sorry, folks. Did I start pressing the wrong button? There we go. All right. The third factor is respect towards opponents. So what happens with most people is that, remember, we attribute disagreement to bias and error on the part of the other person. And so the extent to which you're able to say, look, I understand how reasonable, sensible people could have this view is what makes you high on the third factor. The fourth factor is your tolerance for taboo issues. So everyone in this room has some things that are just off the table for them. Some things we just don't talk about. And people who are more receptive have sort of a shorter list of issues that they're just unwilling to talk about. So what I think is tremendously valuable, is thinking about your factors. Right? What are the things that are hard for you versus easy for you, and how can you get better? What are the things that sort of trigger you to be less receptive out of the 4 versus what are the things that come naturally? So that's what I would do with your scores, is think about those particular issues, okay? Now, what I want you to take away from sort of this first part of talking about individual level receptiveness is that it is a key communication and decision-making skill, right? It makes you process information differently, and the way in which it's different is you are basically having a more balanced information diet. So it makes you a better decision maker. As a result of that, it should be measured and it should be trained. Right? This is a 5-minute long assessment that we can give to people, and we can say, okay, can we take people who are higher on this and put them in those contexts where we really need to have somebody see both sides of the issue? Okay, so that's the individual level, cultivating individual level receptiveness. What can we do at the interpersonal level? So at one point, after we sort of had the scale and said, this seems important, we thought, well, can anybody tell if receptive people are receptive? Right? Is this something visible, or do you always have to take the test? And so we ran a study. This was done in the context of an executive education program that I teach in at the Kennedy School, where we invited a large sample of state and local government officials. So this is like police chiefs, fire chiefs, mayors of small towns, those sorts of folks. And they come to this program for 3 weeks. And on the first day of the program, we asked them about how receptive they were. So we gave them the scale. And then we asked them for their opinions on a bunch of really hot button issues. So this is everything from Black Lives Matter, marijuana legalization, the death penalty. And then we paired them up with somebody they strongly disagree with, okay? So now remember, this is folks in state and local government. They are not, college sophomores. They're grown-ups with really well-formed policy views on issues that they touch every single day. And so they come to our lab, and they are in sort of individual carols, and they're talking through a chat platform to somebody they disagree with on one of these issues. They have a conversation that goes for about 20 minutes, and then we say, okay, you said you were some amount of receptive, but how receptive were you in this particular conversation? And how receptive was your partner in this particular conversation? And by the way, do you want to ever talk to this person again? Right? Do you want to work with them? Do you want their opinions on other topics? And so here is what we get. Whoops. I'm having trouble with my slides. What we get is two things. I will tell you what we get. What we get is a strong positive relationship between perceptions of receptiveness and desire to work together. So even if we strongly disagree, if I think you're more receptive, I want to have you on my team. I think you have better judgment. I think you will be better able to represent me. But the problem is this. The problem is when people say, I see you as being more receptive, we have no idea what they're talking about. Right? Because they had this chat interaction. Some people were rated as more receptive. According to what criteria, right? What comes across as more receptive? So that's problem one. How is receptiveness expressed? Perhaps the bigger problem is that we saw a very low correlation between self-reported receptiveness and partner perceptions of receptiveness. Which is confusing because I just told you that self-reported receptiveness predicts all of these important things. So we know that thing is real, but it seems like people are unable to express it, right? People who are receptive don't sound receptive, okay? And so to try to figure out what's going on, we basically turned to natural language processing. So we ended up writing a natural language processing algorithm to try to identify what makes people sound receptive. Because in the end, in conflict, it matters a lot more what you sound like than what is actually happening on the inside of your brain, right? Nobody can tell what's happening inside your head. What we're interested in are what are the words and phrases, what are the specific behaviors that people use in language that make their counterparts say, oh, this is a receptive person, and as a result, I want to work with them, okay? So here is how you sort of do, natural language processing for people who are not computational linguists. I'm not a computational linguist, so it took me like a long time to wrap my brain around this. So the first thing you do is you collect a large sample of conversations. We paired up like 1,200 pairs of people who all happen to disagree on whatever it is we told them to discuss. And they have these conversations via chat, so we have all of their transcripts. We then get a separate sample of participants, and they read the transcripts. And for each transcript that you read, you're asked to evaluate how receptive did the people in this conversation seem, okay? Step 3 is you write a machine learning model that basically picks out the words and phrases in the transcripts from step 1 that predict the ratings given by the raters in step 2, okay? So for the nerds in the room, right, it is just a giant regression where you have a bunch of words and phrases that are correlated with human ratings of receptiveness, which I recognize all sounds incredibly abstract, so I'm going to give you an example. Okay, we're gonna play my favorite game. It's called Pretend You're an Algorithm. Okay, the way this game works, I understand it's 8 o'clock in the morning. The game is not gonna be that fun. The way the game works is I'm going to show you 2 pieces of text from our data. These 2 people are responding to a question about the Black Lives Matter movement. So this is like 5 years ago when we collected these data. The 2 people whose statements you will see agree with each other. They're expressing basically the same point of view, and they're responding to the same person that they disagree with. But what I want you to notice is their tone is quite different. And what I want you to try to do is identify which one of them is more receptive, okay? So there's going to be 2, and we're going to vote. Do we want the first one or the second one? Okay, so here's the first one. I understand what you're saying. There's probably some truth to the fact that these issues have been hidden for a long time. However, coming from St. Louis and witnessing the Ferguson riots, I can also see how things can be blown out of proportion and make people feel that it is worse than it is. I agree real problems exist, but possibly sometimes attention is drawn to the wrong places. Okay, so that's the first person. Here's the second person. Overreacting to police confrontations can be deadly to the public in general. When animosity towards the police rises, as it has in Chicago, police do not feel safe going into the ghetto neighborhoods. Therefore, those people in those neighborhoods literally have to fend for themselves, because if they need the police and call for their help, the police can't help those in need there, because they will likely be shot at themselves. All right, so which one is the more receptive one, 1 or 2? Who votes for 1? Okay, anybody votes for 2? Oh boy. Okay, so 100% consensus, right? Total 100% consensus. We see that the first one is more receptive. And in fact, I made the task easy. These are completely cherry-picked. So this is one of the most receptive texts in our data set. This is one of the least receptive texts in our data set. But here's this, imagine this. Imagine there was an alien that came from space and wanted to become more receptive. How would I teach the alien from space, who is not a human psychologist, to talk like the first person and not the second person, right? We all kind of get that there's a difference. We understand that, we feel the difference. But picking out the specific linguistic behaviors that make the difference is hard. And so that's what the algorithm does for us. It spits out a figure like this. On the y-axis are features of language. And what we have here is the frequency that those features are used with in text that's rated as more versus less receptive by humans, okay? So for example, things like negation and reasoning are more common in less receptive language, whereas all these other features are more common in more receptive language. If we go back to our examples, they actually are distinguished by these 5 features. So negation are things like no, can't, won't, don't. It's negating what your counterpart said. Reasoning is my personal ironic favorite. Reasoning are words like however, therefore, because, although. They're academic words that make you sound really smart. They also make you sound really condescending. Acknowledgement is using some of your own airtime to restate what the other person said. So cues of acknowledgement are things like, I understand that this is really important to you, or I hear what you are saying is X, Y, Z. Hedges are ways of introducing a tiny bit of uncertainty into your speech so that the other person is a little bit less tempted to jump in and do it for you, right? So it's words like perhaps, sometimes, occasionally, possibly. And then agreement is looking for some areas of consensus even though you happen to disagree about the main thing you're talking about, right? So it's, I agree that it's been a really hard couple years. Or we both want to create safe schools for our children, okay? So if we go back to our examples, I understand is an acknowledgement, probably is a hedge. I can also see is agreement. I agree is agreement, but possibly sometimes is a hedge. On the other side, we have do not and can't, which are negations, and therefore because and because are reasoning words. What I want you to notice is what the algorithm picks out has nothing to do with the actual topic. So you can run this analysis on any conversation, irrespective of topic, and we've done this across a variety of topics, and the results are consistent because the signals of receptiveness do not rely on, are we talking about gun violence, are we talking about vaccines, or are we talking about charter schools? So we have come to call this style of communication conversational receptiveness, right? And that's sort of to distinguish it from like the receptiveness in your head that we call cognitive receptiveness. Conversational receptiveness is made up of specific words and phrases that make people feel heard, right? And we now know that it strongly predicts conflict outcomes. So we can analyze large amounts of text and show that when one party is receptive in the beginning of the conversation, the other party is less likely to fly off the handle by the end of the conversation. Conversational receptiveness is also easy to learn and imitate, right? So learning specific words and phrases is by far easier than learning to be empathetic or take other people's perspectives, or exhibit intellectual humility, because most of us don't know exactly how to do those things, but we all know how to memorize some words and incorporate them into our speech. The algorithm spits out a list of 38 language features that predict receptiveness. That's by far more than anybody can learn easily, and that's not useful. So what we have done over time is pared it down to a small handful that predicts the most variance in the data. And because my graduate students are clever, they came up with an acronym to help us memorize the important features. The acronym is HEAR, as in I hear you, okay? So the H in HEAR stands for hedging. Phrases like, I think it's possible that, or this might happen because, or some people tend to think. The E stands for emphasizing agreement. I think we both want to, or I agree with some of what you're saying, or we are both concerned with. The A stands for acknowledging other perspectives, right? So it's sort of a gift you give to the other person because you have airtime and they have airtime and we're constantly fighting over airtime. I'm going to give some of my airtime to restating your point of view. I understand that. I see your point. What I think you're saying is. And the R stands for reframing to the positive. So I think it's great when, or I really appreciate it when, or it would be so wonderful if. So one of my favorite examples is instead of saying, I hate it when people interrupt me, saying, I really appreciate it when people let me finish my sentences. All right, so we've talked about the personal. We've talked about the interpersonal. Now I want to take a sort of up a level of analysis and think about what we can do at the organizational level. At the organizational level, you all are sort of doing it right now, right? Which is, first of all, recognizing the value of receptiveness to opposing views, recognizing that we are living in a time of tremendous social and political engagement. And what this means is that organizations need to build the skills and the capacity to enable employees to talk about all of the beliefs and all of the convictions that they bring to work with them, right? The lines between our personal lives, our political lives, and our professional lives are constantly blurring. And so the question is, how can we create organizational cultures where people feel comfortable speaking up about their beliefs, but at the same time are required to engage in a thoughtful and respectful way with the disagreeing beliefs of others? Receptiveness has a variety of barriers, right? So one of the things we've talked about today is there's variance in how receptive people normally are, right? So there's sort of an individual level variation that you have to deal with. But it also happens to be the case that sometimes when people are very receptive, they just don't know how to make it transparent, right? So one of the barriers is people simply don't know how to use the right words. Another barrier can be structural. So we often ensconce ourselves in sort of silos of like-minded others. If you think about the people who you spend the most time with at work, how many of them really have different beliefs, right? We tend to select ourselves into situations where people agree with us. And so from an organizational standpoint, that's a problem, because if you're trying to encourage open-mindedness to opposing perspectives and nobody has ever encountered an opposing perspective in their daily life, that's going to be hard. Communicating a framework for receptive conversations, right? So again, instead of telling people, be receptive, what does that actually mean? So here is a framework. It gives people concrete behaviors that they can enact and that are measurable and observable so that they know, are they succeeding or are they not? Beyond sort of telling folks what to do, we want to create structures to support them in doing it. So for example, I think it's tremendously important when there is shared knowledge about these ideas to be able to go to a colleague and say, look, I am getting ready for this difficult conversation, and I simply don't think I can be calm and sensible about it. Can you help me? Right? Can we have sort of receptiveness buddies, if you will? A person who will help you maintain some emotional equanimity in the face of really frustrating conversations. And can we include that as one of our competencies that we care about when we evaluate performance, right? When we say somebody is a strong communicator or a good leader, right, can we consider being able to have conversations across ideological divides as one of the things that's included explicitly in being a good communicator and a good leader? And finally, I think of receptiveness as a skill set, right? It is not sort of a magical aura, it is a muscle. And so it is something that needs to be exercised. It is something that people are worse at when they're tired or when they're stressed. And so to the extent that we give people opportunities to practice having challenging conversations, they're more likely to be able to do it successfully when they have to do it in the moment. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for training here. Okay, I have shared the ideas I wanted to share. I'm very happy to take some questions. I know there's sort of a fabulous panel of people that are about to join me who can talk about how some of their organizations face these problems. So I can take a couple of questions now while the other panelists come up, and then we can get on with the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
First, fantastic talk. So has the work gone on to look at any correlation between the perception that the other is receptive and the likelihood that either party will change their mind?
Excellent question. Excellent question. Yes. So there's sort of a couple really interesting things there. One, I think you're identifying a very subtle and very important idea, which is that almost every conversation we have with people who we disagree with, our underlying goal is to change their mind. And that feels intuitive, right? That feels right. And the problem there is that if I'm trying to change your mind and you're trying to change my mind, and we're both reasonably stubborn people, nothing is going to happen, right? All that will happen is we'll walk away more frustrated. So one of the things that I've really been sort of inviting people to do more is think about all the other goals we might have in a conversation. So can you understand where the other person is coming from? Can you make them feel heard? Can you just give yourself the chance to feel heard? Say, look, I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I just want you to understand where I'm coming from. Can we say, look, I understand where you're coming from. You understand where I'm coming from. We're never going to agree on this, but now let's talk about this other thing that we need to now jointly work on, right? So there are a lot of goals in conversation besides attitude change, and I think that's very, very important to keep in mind. But to your specific question, we have done studies where we compare people who are trained in conversational receptiveness to people who are just sort of using their natural persuasion style. And what we find is that conversational receptiveness is, in fact, more persuasive. I think an important reason it's more persuasive is because it lets people see each other in sort of a more nuanced way, right? So I'm not so busy sort of defending my position against this like very extreme person because now this person doesn't seem as extreme. I think the most important thing conversational receptiveness does is it builds the groundwork for the next conversation. Should we get everybody else up here?
Yep. Thanks, Dr. Minson. One question.
Yeah.
Really appreciate your talk, and I'm already thinking about sort of my emails and texts that I've been sending. I'm curious about sort of the you highlighted beautifully the conversation or the content of the conversation. I'm wondering about your thoughts on some of the nonverbal elements of receptiveness, and then, in this era of web conferencing, how do you promote receptiveness in that format?
Thank you. That's a great question. So there is a fantastic researcher at UC Berkeley, Juliana Schroeder, who studies explicitly communication modalities. And a lot of her work basically points to this idea that the human voice, like specifically voice, has a humanizing impact. So if you have a choice between making a phone call or sending a text and it's a difficult conversation, you should make the phone call. It turns out there isn't like a huge additional benefit to getting on Zoom or, TMAP or whatever. Like the face doesn't help a whole lot. What helps is the voice. So that's one piece of it. As far as body language, people tend to be very sort of consistent in their physical expression, in their verbal cues, in their paralinguistic cues, so things like uh-huh and nodding and mm-hmm. It's hard to sound really receptive while looking really unreceptive, right? So the two things basically just go in tandem. When you are face-to-face, there are more cues that your listener can rely on, right? So they see you nodding, they see you smiling, they see you leaning forward, and that just tends to support the things that you're also saying with your language.
Hi. Just thank you for sharing this information. One question I have around the kind of the taboo topics or the things that you're very connected to.
Yeah.
And if there's, how do you handle sort of the difference in maybe emotional labor or kind of lack of safety and space on when certain topics are kind of welcomed to be discussed when it's not so casual for some folks versus others? So how do you kind of maintain that sort of psychological safety for folks in these conversations when it's not so, you can't really both sides every issue, right, as an individual?
Right. So I think it depends on whether you are the person who is sort of the leader who is orchestrating the conversation, or if you're the person in the conversation for whom it's personal. I think a really important leadership behavior is to name the fact that different topics are personal to different people for different reasons, right? And quite often, you can't see from looking at the person, or you don't know what is sort of that underlying history that might make this particular conversation really challenging for them. And so naming that explicitly, I think, is very, very important. And then if you are the person who is being personally touched by it, I think an important, obviously I'm pro receptiveness, right? I'm like pro people having more conversations about more things, but that doesn't mean that all of us need to be talking about all the things all the time, right? So if I'm a tiny bit more willing to talk about some topics, great. Do I have the obligation to be constantly representing whatever is my deepest, most personal, most emotionally laden conviction? No, right? It's not my job. So I think it is perfectly okay to say to yourself, look, this is not the right time. This is not the right context. I'm not having this conversation right now. Respectfully, no, thank you. And that's, I don't think that's a failure. I think that's just us being people and having a limited capacity. Okay, all right.
Thank you so much for a great talk and a great topic. I'm the nerd in the room that's interested in the NLP model that you presented. And as anybody knows, an algorithm is only as robust as the voices going into it. And so I'm interested in your research if what's the demographic breakdown of the responses you got, and have you been able to splice the data by culture, by language, by geography?
Yeah, thank you. So what, initially, right, our algorithm was based on evaluations from American online participants. They tend to lean liberal. They tend to lean young-ish, like people in their early 30s. Over time, what happens, right, the great thing about NLP is that you can apply it to a lot of data sets quickly and see if you get consistent results. And so one of the things we know is that these results tend to hold up quite well looking at sort of conversations we assembled, but also looking at data sets you can basically just scrape from the internet, right? Because there's a lot of disagreement on the internet. And so we can scrape the data and put it through the algorithm and get very parallel results. What I don't have that people ask about in every talk is data from other languages, right? Because what we need is somebody who's a really good computational linguist who can code a lot of R and who is a native speaker of whatever other language we want to do this in. So if anybody wants to help with that research, I'm looking for partners. Like, pick a language, let's try to translate conversational receptiveness into it. I think that would be tremendously valuable.
Okay, so quick question. So first of all, let me just say thank you. I think that it's really caused me to reflect a lot over my personal communications, particularly around political discourse over the last several weeks. And so I think that was excellent. We often use psychological testing in our team communications to really help us understand how we can communicate better as a team. DISC assessment, for instance, has really helped with understanding the way in which we talk to each other. And I'm just wondering if you've thought about integrating receptiveness testing as a method for team building and ways in which we can do that, among our breaking down silos among our teams.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a very effective tool. So we do a lot of this through the executive education program at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I have a small consultancy called Disagreeing Better. It's useful to look at your own receptiveness, right, and then really think hard about the barriers. Right, so a lot of this conversation has been about thinking what gets in the way. So the desire to persuade, right, or sort of the concern that with some issues we don't want to give equal standing to both sides, right, or the concern that if I'm receptive to you, then this third party might think that I agree with you, which I very definitely don't agree with you. So those types of trainings, I think, can be tremendously useful because you give people concrete information grounded in actual behavioral science, right? And then you give them tools for sort of improving their own performance and their own communication. So I'm a big fan.